Hi, hope you're having a good weekend. Thought I would talk about two-way analyses and do a relatively simple example, but which will illustrate at least the kind of things I'm looking for in your next homework. Okay, interested in looking at baseball attendance, and here's a picture of a baseball stadium in the crowd. And we'd like to understand some of the patterns of attendance. For example, we're interested in how baseball attendance has changed over time. We're also interested in comparing the average attendance for four different baseball teams. And once we understand the general trends in time and between teams, we can look for the things that deviate from those patterns, which will be the residuals. Okay, so here's my data, and I've collected the average attendance for Milwaukee, Minnesota, New York Mets, and the Pittsburgh Pirates for the seasons of 1975 through 2015. So we're interested in exploring the structure of this table. Okay, so we graph the data to get some sense of what's going on. It looks like there is a general increase over time. Also, I noticed that certain teams tend to have more baseball fans. Like I noticed that the New York Mets, which is the blue curve, looks a bit higher than, say, the purple curve, which is Pittsburgh. Okay, so we're going to do this thing called median polish, and essentially it's much like an ANOVA two-way fit, but it's a resistant way of doing the fit. So it's based on medians instead of means. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to look for trends over time. We're interested in comparing teams. And then we want to look past the additive fit and look for deviations from the pattern, which we call, these are residuals. Okay, so it's pretty simple to do. Once I have a matrix of the data, then I use the med polish command to do the median polish. And when you save it in a thing called fit, and it'll give you an overall value, a vector called rho, a vector called col, and a matrix called residuals. Okay, so we first noticed that the overall value is about 20,000. That means that overall, across teams and years, the average attendance is 20,000 people. Let's see, then we look at the row effects, and this will allow us to make comparisons between seasons. Now, the actual value isn't that useful because some of the values are negative, but we look at differences. So, for example, if we want to look at the difference between 1975 and 1980, we look at the difference, and we look at the difference is 1128, which means that the average attendance in 1980 was about 1,000 more than it was in 1975. Now, here it might be interesting to look at these row effects as a function of season. We can graph that to get a better understanding how things change. Also, we can look for differences between teams, and again, we look at differences. And so here I'll look at the difference. I'm interested in comparing New York Mets and in Minnesota, and I see a typo, but that's okay. But anyway, the difference is about 9,000, which means that on the average, New York draws about 9,000 more fans than Minnesota. Okay, now this additive fit was interesting, but that wasn't necessarily a good fit. In order to see if it's a good fit or not, we look at the residuals. We're interested in how large they are relative to the common row effects. We're interested in any patterns in the residuals. And we're also interested in looking for outliers. Outliers are residuals that deviate a lot from the general residual. Okay, so here are my residuals, and I'm quickly scanning over them. And we can plot them in different ways, but one thing I notice is that some seem very large. I see one residual that's over 12,000, a couple more that are less than 10,000. So really, the general comment I see is that the residuals tend to be large. And when I say large, I'm thinking of comparing them relative to the sizes of the row and column effects. So really, this sort of confirms the kind of thing we saw in the picture, that we didn't have a nice smooth relationship of the average attendance with respect to season. Okay, now what's going on here? Well, it's true to say that attendance is growing, and it's also true to say that certain teams, like the big market teams that are in New York City, tend to draw more fans than the small market teams like Minnesota. But the thing that we're missing here is that there are other factors or covariates that influence attendance, and so you can probably imagine what they are. One idea, one method, one factor which influences things is winning and losing. That teams, fans like to go to teams that are winning teams, and that could influence attendance. Okay, so thanks and have a good week.